Bazooka Charlie, the pilot who strapped bazookas to his plane. World War II, 1944. Major Charles Carpenter, also known as Bazooka Charlie and the Mad Major, was an American pilot of World War II. He was credited with eliminating at least 6 German tanks and several other armored vehicles during the 1944 campaign in Western Europe using bazookas. The crazy thing was, he destroyed all the vehicles while flying in his L-4 Grasshopper light reconnaissance airplane. This highly unusual war hero was a history teacher in the Moline, Illinois high school. Like many other patriots, he joined the Army in 1942, eager to do his bit in the war effort. As a commissioned second lieutenant, he completed his flight training and was assigned to flying light observation aircraft. Such aircraft were designed to survey the battle area, report enemy positions, and spot targets for the artillery to fire at. For this purpose, Carpenter was sent to General George S. Patton's 3rd Army Group that was racing through France towards the German border. Along with his Piper L-4H Grasshopper plane, he was attached to the 4th Armored Division. In addition to surveillance missions, Carpenter was also assigned as a private pilot to the divisional commander, General John S. Wood. Carpenter accompanied his division along its entire campaign, excelling in his duty. However, being his comrades' eyes in the sky was not how he imagined fighting in the war. Charles Carpenter was more of a daredevil and craving for action. His impatience almost cost him his life. On one occasion, as he was driving in a jeep searching the area for landing fields, German infantry surprised and attacked his unit. Carpenter didn't waste time. He jumped on top of one of the M4 Sherman tanks like a seasoned infantryman, grabbed a .50 caliber machine gun and started shooting at the Germans. Carpenter took command of the situation and shouted at his comrades to move forward and repel the enemy attack. In the heat of battle, Carpenter ordered the Sherman's gunner to shoot at one of the enemy vehicles. As it turned out, it was an Allied Sherman bulldozer tank. Luckily, the only damage was a blown-off blade. His superiors were not impressed by Carpenter's exploits. He was arrested and accused of recklessness in carrying out friendly fire and threatened with a court-martial. Fortunately, Carpenter's case came to the attention of the 3rd Army's commander, General Patton. Patton appreciated the heroism of his fighting men and therefore had all charges dropped. He also declared that the Army needed more men who fought like Charles Carpenter. Major Carpenter returned to his duties but was strictly forbidden to interfere with the ground forces again. Still itching to get stuck in, he had no intention of spending the rest of the war without seeing more action against the Germans. At one point, he heard that other pilots were mounting bazookas onto their light aircraft to attack and strafe enemy tanks on the ground, so he did the same. With the approval of the divisional headquarters, Carpenter took 2 M1A1 bazookas and mounted them onto the wings of his small L-4H Grasshopper. The number quickly increased to 6 bazookas, 3 on each wing. Each bazooka was wired back to the pilot's cockpit from where Carpenter fired them by flipping switches on a console. Later, the M1A1 launchers were replaced with more powerful M9s. Carpenter named his plane Rosie the Rocketer, in tribute to Rosie the Riveter, the symbol of women working in factories back in the States. The M1A1 rocket launcher, or bazooka, fired a 2.36-inch M6 rocket, which by the time of the 1944 campaign was pretty ineffective against the armor of most German tanks, especially the Tigers and Panthers. Major Carpenter, however, had an advantage of firing his M6 rockets from above, aiming for the top of the turret, which had significantly lighter protection. Carpenter's tactic was to dive his aircraft directly at the enemy tanks and fire his bazookas from a height of 300 feet or 100 meters. He would then pull up his plane trying to escape the enemy's return fire as quickly as possible. The tactics proved to be very effective as he managed to destroy several armored vehicles. As General Wood's private pilot, Carpenter had a lot of spare time. He used it for the search and destroy missions that earned him the nickname Bazooka Charlie. The story of a flying menace with bazookas soon started spreading among the German army as well. When a light plane with bazookas attached was spotted, the Germans would open fire with everything they had. The problem with aircraft such as the L-4H Grasshopper was that they were very slow and as a result posed an easy target to enemy fire. Each mission therefore carried a lot of risks for Carpenter. Many other pilots considered his actions to be almost suicidal and called him the Mad Major. Mad or not, Major Charles Carpenter did his best to help win the war. He carried out his most notable mission on September 20th, 1944, during the Battle of Aricourt, part of the Lorraine Campaign. A sudden attack by German panzer units got the support units of the 4th Armored Division pinned down and in danger of being completely overrun. Because of the dense fog, they were denied air support. Still, Bazooka Charlie went to the rescue. When the fog cleared, he located the German panzers and attacked them with his bazookas. After firing all 6 of his rocket launchers, he returned to base to refuel and reload them and made another attack. He flew 3 combat sorties that day, firing 16 rockets against German vehicles. The result was that several armored vehicles and 2 Panther tanks were knocked out. The German panzers withdrew and the U.S. Armored Support Unit was relieved. Carpenter's heroism was endless. On another occasion, he destroyed an entire German column, but instead of returning to base, he landed his plane to inspect the damage that he had caused. As he approached the smoking remains of the column, he grabbed a rifle from a dead German and took 6 enemy soldiers prisoner. In recognition of his gallantry, Major Charles Carpenter was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and awarded the Bronze Star, the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, and the Silver Star with Oak Leaf Cluster. Unfortunately, in early 1945, Charles Carpenter was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease and sent home. Doctors told him he would not live for more than 2 years. Carpenter returned home to his old job of teaching history. Being the fighter he was, he would live on for another 21 years. Undisputedly, Charles Carpenter was one of the most unusual and bravest warriors of World War II. In 2017, the dusty remains of Rosie the Rocketer were found in the Österreichisches Luftfahrtmuseum, Aircraft Museum in Austria, and purchased by the Collings Foundation, who brought the plane back to the USA for restoration. As it neared completion, the final bit of artwork was painted on it by Charles Carpenter's granddaughter, Erin. The axe-murdering teacher. 1892. It was early in 1892, just outside of the small town of Fall River in Massachusetts, USA, at the Borden's family farm. There was a scene of a brief but deadly cold-hearted killing spree. For in the barn lay the beheaded bodies of a dozen or so innocent victims, all killed by the farm owner, retired 70-year-old banker Andrew Borden. His wife Abby and one of his daughters Emma were practical farming folk and understood the need for the killing, having themselves regularly slaughtered chickens and pigs for the dinner table. So this killing to them was no different, and they busied themselves collecting the bodies ready to be cleaned up and made into pies. But Andrew's other daughter, Lizzie, was much more sensitive about seeing her beloved pigeons being slaughtered. For she had raised them since they had been born, more as pets, unlike others who simply saw them as yet another food source on the farm. Lizzie and her father had never been close, and she had always resented him for marrying a woman called Abby Gray a few years after her mother's death. Lizzie's relationship with her stepmother, Abby, had deteriorated even further when she had found out that her father had bought several properties in secret. What distressed Lizzie was that the benefactor was her stepmother at the expense of herself and her sister Emma. A house was even purchased for Sarah Gray Whitehead, Abby's younger half-sister. A few months later, there would be more slaughter at the Borden farm. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, Lizzie was in the barn and heard a strange noise from the house. She rushed into the house and into the sitting room. What she saw was truly horrifying. Lying dead on the couch was her father, his face badly disfigured as someone had struck him several times with a hatchet, killing him almost instantly. Lizzie then summoned the maid Bridget Sullivan, but didn't let her go into the sitting room, feeling that the sight of her dead father would be too much for the young maid. Earlier, Lizzie's 64-year-old stepmother had told Bridget that she was out visiting a sick friend, but she was found shortly after Mr. Borden's body was discovered. She was lying face down in the guest room upstairs. She had also been murdered, having been savagely hacked to death from behind with a hatchet. But what was noticeable about her death compared to her husband's was it had been much more violent and intense, as if the assailant had hated the victim, something that was later brought up at the murder trial. And the hatchet, thought to have been used to kill both victims, may have in fact been the same one used by Lizzie's father to kill her much-beloved pigeons a few months earlier. The police investigated and put together the following timeline. The timing of the deaths were most odd. The medical examiner concluded that the stepmother was killed from behind at around 9 a.m. while cleaning the guest room floor. But the father was not killed until about 11 a.m. He had arrived home at approximately 10:45 a.m. unexpectedly, having been out on business most of the morning. He had then gone into the sitting room to take a nap. Lizzie discovered her murdered father at 11:10 a.m. It did strike the police as strange that in such a small 3-story house, nothing untoward was seen or heard as going on by either Lizzie or the maid the whole morning. Yet 2 people who had been brutally murdered went unnoticed by the pair of them. The maid's explanation for this was that she had spent the entire morning cleaning the outside of the house on the instructions of the stepmother, Mrs. Borden. She was then resting from her duties in the 3rd-floor room, while Lizzie claimed she was in the barn searching for lead sinkers for an upcoming fishing excursion. The police did carry out a search of the house, but later admitted that it was only a cursory inspection, and they did not carry out a thorough search until 2 days later, on August 6th. At the inquest into the deaths, the medical examiner noted Mr. Borden had been killed by being struck at least 9 times with a hatchet, one blow slicing through his eyeball. The stepmother had been killed by 17 deeper, more intense blows to the back of her head. Lizzie's testimony at the inquest was all over the place, making little sense, and she contradicted herself continually. Also, some of the things she said were simply not true, like she said she helped her father put on his slippers before he took his fateful nap. But the crime scene photographs clearly showed him still wearing his shoes. On August 11, 1892, the police arrested Lizzie based on her confused answers at the inquest and on the fact that she had the most to gain from the death of her father and stepmother. Her father was a wealthy man, and with the stepmother dead, the 2 sisters stood to inherit a small fortune. The trial of Lizzie Borden began in June 1893 and became a national sensation. At one stage during the trial, both victims' skulls were admitted as evidence, forcing the proceedings to halt temporarily as this gruesome sight had caused Lizzie to faint. But there was no solid evidence that Lizzie committed the murders, and to the community she had a spotless character, teaching Sunday school. Lizzie was also the treasurer and secretary of the local branch of the Christian Endeavor Society, which helped to promote the society's message of leading an earnest Christian life among its members. So with her being so highly respected in the community, the jury had no problem finding her innocent. Lizzie never left Fall River. Her and her sister moved into a modern house in the wealthy neighborhood of The Hill. She died 35 years later of pneumonia on June 1, 1927. Her younger sister, Emma, died a few days later of a kidney disease. Neither ever married. The press and investigators never stopped hounding Lizzie, who mostly were convinced that she had carried out the murders. No one else was ever tried for the crime, and to this day, it's officially seen as an unsolved case. So who did murder Andrew and Abby Borden on that fateful morning in 1892? The suspects are as follows. The older daughter, Emma Borden. At 36 years old and a spinster, Emma was unlikely to find a husband in an era where women were normally married off by their early 20s. Could it be that she was fearful of her stepmother inheriting everything if her father died? Meaning she faced an old age of abject poverty as she had neither a profession nor a husband to support her? So maybe she had a possible motive. But at the time of the murder, she had an alibi. She was visiting friends 15 miles away, and also her character was seen as impeccable. The resentful 25-year-old maid from Ireland, Bridget Sullivan? Abby Borden was very strict, and some would say she was mean when it came to how she treated her maid, insisting on the day of the murder that Bridget clean the outside of the house thoroughly, despite the maid's protest that she was ill and that it was in the middle of a particularly bad heat wave. Could it be she simply snapped and brutally killed Abby in a rage and later the father in order to cover up her crime? The highly respectable 32-year-old younger daughter, Lizzie Borden. Did the police get it right in the first place, but didn't have enough evidence to prove it was her? It is true Lizzie had much to gain from the death of her father and stepmother. For if her elderly father died, her stepmother was due to inherit his vast fortune, and Abby had many relatives. On top of this, Andrew Borden, despite his wealth, was frugal. The Borden house lacked indoor plumbing and electricity, while Andrew's cousins lived on The Hill, a neighborhood for the wealthy which he could easily afford to live. Could it be that Lizzie feared she would never get her hands on what was rightfully hers? Would she go to any lengths possible to live on The Hill? But if Lizzie had carried out both the murders, did she change out of a blood-stained dress twice? Or did she walk around for nearly 2 hours in a blood-stained dress, which seems inconceivable? But the fact of the matter was that the police didn't search the house properly for evidence until 2 days later, giving Lizzie plenty of time to get rid of any incriminating evidence. It is true that Lizzie was found in the kitchen by her sister and family friend burning what Lizzie claimed to be an old paint-stained dress. This may seem incriminating, but we must bear in mind that this was the morning of August 7th, the day after the house had been thoroughly searched by the police for evidence. Could it be that Lizzie's explanation regarding burning the dress was the correct one? And as for her shambolic and contradictory statements at court, can it be simply due to the side effects of the morphine she had been prescribed by her doctor at the time for stress and anxiety? There is another theory it might have been manslaughter from diminished responsibility, as Lizzie's mother had suffered from seizures that made her violent and go into uncontrollable rages, which she had no recollection of afterwards. It is said that Lizzie suffered from this too, but it seems hardly possible that if this was true, she had an episode that lasted over 2 hours. Could it be a relative? Then there was the strange case of Lizzie's maternal 59-year-old uncle, a Mr. John Vinicum Morse. The night before the murders, he had arrived unexpectedly with no luggage at the Borden's house. This wasn't unusual, as he often arrived unannounced like this to discuss business with his brother-in-law, Andrew. It is said that despite the heat, he would wear the same clothes for 2 days at a time. Uncle John left the next morning to visit some nephews and nieces, returning later that day after the murders had been committed. The police considered him a suspect for a while, as his alibi at the time of the murders seemed just too perfectly detailed and rehearsed. Also, it didn't help that he once trained as a butcher and seemed to be quite emotionally unaffected by the murders, but the police concluded that he was just very eccentric and cold-hearted. There was also the inescapable fact that his alibi, being several miles away at the time of the murders, checked out. So the police dismissed him being a possible suspect and continued to look at other suspects. Was it a murderous intruder? The farm was secluded and the family were well known to be rich, so an opportunist thief was not too far-fetched a notion. Murdering one of the residences in the area might make sense if the thief had been discovered. But for the murderous thief to hide and wait for 2 hours and then kill the returning husband, but not the 2 other women in the house, does seem far-fetched. Even so, it was known that Andrew Borden was quite an unpopular man in town and had made many enemies in his business dealings. Was it a serial killer? 5 days before the trial, a local woman was hacked to death with a hatchet in her kitchen by a Portuguese immigrant named Jose Correa de Mello. She had been struck 23 times to the head. Jose was later convicted of the woman's murder. The prosecution believed it was a burglary gone wrong. Even though it must have seemed strange to have 2 murders so close together in such a small town, nobody thought there was a link between the 2 cases, despite the murder sharing similarities such as being committed in broad daylight and the murderer entering and leaving unseen. It is worth noting that Jose, according to official records, didn't come to America until after the Bordens were murdered. Was it a combination of people? Could it be that Lizzie had an accomplice? Could her accomplice have been the maid? And could they have carried out the murder together with Lizzie paying her off with her inheritance? It is true that Bridget left the family employment shortly after the murders, but accounts differ regarding what happened to her next. Some say she found employment elsewhere and eventually married, while another more tantalizing account was that she suddenly and mysteriously came into a large amount of money and was never to be heard of again. An intriguing combination of people and events? Could it be that Abby was killed by an intruder or serial killer who then fled or left the scene? Whereupon Lizzie, seizing the opportunity, murdered her father, later hoping to blame it all on the other murderer. It might seem far-fetched, but maybe Lizzie was desperate enough to carry out such a fiendish plan. Again, not realizing that science had advanced far enough to figure out the time of the two deaths were 2 hours apart. Could it be that Lizzie hired someone to do the killings? This would account for the fact there was no bloodied dress or that no killer was ever found. With her father and stepmother dead, she could easily pay off her accomplice quite handsomely. The case remains nearly 130 years later unsolved. At the time of the trial, public opinion was that Lizzie was innocent. But soon enough, the public turned against her, and this can be best summed up by a popular children's skipping rope rhyme at the time. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Nikolai Morozov, the oldest World War II soldier who died aged 92 in 1946. When, at the age of 87, Nikolai Morozov picked up a rifle to fight the Germans, he became the oldest combatant of World War II. In the winter of 1942, Morozov volunteered to help break the siege of Leningrad that had lasted for more than a year. Nikolai Morozov was born on July 7, 1854, on the Borak estate in the Yaroslavl province as an illegitimate son of Pyotr Shepochkin, a Russian landowner and a servant girl. Being an illegitimate child, Nikolai bore the surname of his mother. Even so, he enjoyed all the privileges of his father's family, primarily regarding his education. As a youngster, Morozov was sent to the Second Moscow Gymnasium, one of the capital's elite schools. While he was there, Nikolai showed signs of being a rebellious young man. He objected to the classical curriculum he attended for its lack of natural science studies. In protest, he helped organize the secret student group, the Society of Naturalists. Nikolai's beliefs, in contrast to the ideas of the old Russia, led him to abandon his studies and completely break off all ties with his family. In early 1874, he gave all of his belongings away and joined the Society of the Circle of Tchaikovsky, the forerunners of the 1917 Russian Revolution. In order to join this radical society, Morozov had to study hard and spread the idea of revolution among the people. It was because of these activities that Morozov had to leave Russia for Switzerland. While he was in exile, Nikolai Morozov became an even more ardent revolutionary, as he became captivated by the works of Karl Marx, who he eventually met a couple of times in later years. He became a journalist, writing articles in workers' newspapers, and was also a member of the Geneva section of the First International. His activities in Switzerland had also brought him to the attention of the Russian authorities, and he was put on their list of wanted criminals. In March of 1875, Morozov was arrested and imprisoned while attempting to enter Russia on suspicion of revolutionary activity. 3 years later, the 193 trial took place, and he was acquitted. After he was released from prison for the first time, Nikolai Morozov continued his revolutionary work with the organization The People's Will by spreading subversive propaganda to achieve the goals of the revolution. Once again, his political activities brought him to the attention of the authorities, and in 1881 he was arrested and tried at the famous Process of 20 trial. The court sentenced him to indefinite hard labor. Morozov was sent to the Peter and Paul Fortress prison in St. Petersburg, from where he was then transferred to the dungeons of the Shishilburg Fortress. During his 25 years of imprisonment, Nikolai's health began to deteriorate, but he managed to broaden his knowledge of languages and natural sciences such as physics, chemistry, astronomy, and history. In 1905, Nikolai Morozov and several of his comrades were released from prison under a political amnesty that followed the 1905 revolution. Upon his release, he continued to teach natural sciences at the University of St. Petersburg, where he was able to create some unusual scientific theories. He was also one of the first Russians to learn to fly a plane in 1910. That same year, he was also imprisoned for one last time for a year because of a revolutionary poem he published called Song of the Stars. Strangely, after the October Revolution and when the Soviet state was established, Morozov decided to stay out of politics. He never became a member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Instead, he was appointed director of the Lizzie Natural Science Institute in Leningrad. It was a duty he performed for the rest of his life, eventually becoming an honorary member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. When the Great Patriotic War started in the summer of 1941, Morozov was at his family estate in Borok. He stayed there throughout the entire war, giving refuge to his colleagues from the institute. At one point during the war, though, he went on a business trip that lasted for a whole month. During that time, he didn't have any contact with his friends or family, and his disappearance remained a mystery even to his biographers. Where did he go? What did he do? Many years later, a story materialized that Morozov had actually been allowed to go and fight on the front line as a Red Army soldier. Morozov was above everything else a patriot. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union and soon after appeared at the gates of the city of Leningrad, he felt it was his duty to help defend his country and his fellow Russians inside the besieged city. Morozov had been a revolutionary all of his life and had no problem in fighting for his ideals despite the fact that he was 87 years old. The problem was that the army was not willing to draft old men just yet, even though in 1942 they needed every man available. Every request sent by Morozov was denied by a local enlistment office. Little did they know who they were dealing with when, fed up with being constantly turned down for active service, he threatened to go right to the top and report the matter to Stalin himself. Only then did the enlistment officer give in and allow him to go to the front, but only for a month, just to shut him up. Under the pretext of going on a business trip, Nikolai Morozov was sent to the Volkhov Front. The Volkhov Front was first formed in December 1941 to hold back the advancing German army. It was disbanded in April of 1942, but once again reformed 2 months later as a part of the Leningrad Front. The front participated in operations aiming to break the siege of Leningrad, attacking the German units from the east. Battle-hardened soldiers of the Volkhov Front were shocked to see an old, gray-haired man with a beard who had come to join their ranks and fight the Germans. His stature barely allowed him to hold the rifle properly. They were even more surprised when Morozov told the battalion commander that he was 87 years old. The battalion was looking for more fit and agile young snipers and ended up getting this very old man instead. Morozov, however, did his best to convince them that they had gotten the right man for the job. By nature, Morozov was an inquisitive person and didn't allow his advanced years to prevent him from learning new things. In 1939, when he was 85, Morozov enrolled in Asaviakim, or a sniper course. Asaviakim was an abbreviation for the Society for the Assistance of Defense, Aircraft, and Chemical Construction, which was a Soviet civil society of volunteers set up to reinforce the army. The society trained civilians in handling weapons, parachuting, and air and chemical defense. In 1941, when the Soviet Union was attacked, the organization had 81,000 trainees in 4,000 groups, over 100 teams, and about 230 detachments. Nikolai Morozov was one of these volunteers. All the skills that he had learned at the Asaviakim were put into practice on the front line. He was able to apply the art of science while shooting, taking into consideration the wind speed and direction, and also the air humidity. It soon became apparent that Morozov was very good at killing Nazis. He had at least 10 enemy kills confirmed. Unfortunately for his sniper career, though, the adventure on the front ended after only a month, as he had been told in the beginning. He was deployed to the rear and asked to contribute further to the war effort by continuing his scientific research. It was not enough for Morozov, who kept on insisting being given more opportunities to fight. This time, the army did not give in to his demands. For the rest of the war, Morozov spent his time at his Borok estate. There is a question of whether the whole story of the oldest soldier of World War II is true or not. or just some propaganda insinuating that all of Mother Russia were fighting together for a common cause. However, after the Leningrad siege was broken, Nikolai Morozov was awarded the Medal for the Defense of Leningrad and the Order of Lenin. So was this something to do with his mysterious business trip on the front line? Nikolai died naturally of old age at his home in Borok on July 30, 1946, age 92, nearly 1 year after the war ended. The asteroid 1210 Morozov, a large rock measuring 33 kilometers or 21 miles in diameter that orbits the Sun between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, is named in his honor, as well as a crater on the Moon.